Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do. To educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. Okay, what's going on, everyone? Welcome to today's show. Today, we are going to dive back into some of the discussion around media and media bias and politics. I mean, we all know that 2020 has been one of those years that if you were not aware of some of the stuff going on in the media prior to 2020, you certainly have been inundated with it during this, sort of 2020, multiple crises in 2020, right? We've had incredible stuff going on. We've had the election. We've obviously had COVID. We've had riots. We've had all kinds of things happening. And we've seen this huge schism between what people think on both sides. And a lot of people getting confused with me, like, where are they getting their information from? And I think we can all agree that the truth is there is no such thing really, and perhaps never has been, such thing as unbiased news. It just simply does not exist, and we need tools. In my mind, we've talked a lot on this particular podcast about the incredible dysfunction that comes as a result of bias. I oftentimes say bias and dogma are the parents of ignorance and arrogance. Bias essentially cuts the legs off of truth. You cannot be an intelligent, rational human and let bias rule your world. It keeps you blinded in a sense. So today I brought in Julie Mastrine, who is a fellow Italian American, which I love. We Italians, we stick together. So my paisano, Julie, came on. She is works with Allsides, one of my top news organizations now, because what Allsides does is show all sides and allows us not to be fooled by fake news and media bias, and allows us to see the bias of different news organizations. And she talks with us today about how Allsides does what they do, and also she helps us understand, even if we're not using something like Allsides, how to spot and deal with media bias. And so let's get into the discussion with Julie. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you at the next show. Enjoy the conversation. Welcome to the show, everybody. I am with someone who I've been, sort of trying to get on the show for a little while. She's from Allsides. Her name is Julie Mastrine. She's Italian like myself. I love those Italians. But I wanted her on, and I wanted you on, Julie, because from my perspective, if we're trying to become better human beings, one of the first things that we need to do as humans is to guard against bias. We all have it. We do it naturally. And in my way of thinking, it blocks us from learning. It blocks us from understanding the world. And there's this conversation that's been going on, and this is the first question I guess I would ask you. For the first time, I think 2020, if people didn't realize the bias and dogma and all the stuff that goes on in the media prior to 2020, they certainly understand it now. And I wanted to just get your take and Allsides' take on the current situation that we find ourselves in, and a little bit about your story and how you found your way here and what Allsides is doing to battle bias in the media? And I'll just let you start wherever you want.
Yeah. So yeah, it has been interesting. The interest in Allsides has just skyrocketed in the last year, with more people finding out about us and understanding that there's a need for what we do. But we've actually been around for a number of years now. Our CEO, he's an old Silicon Valley tech guy, and he was one of the first to work on Netscape Navigator. So he was on the
goes way back.
Yeah, way back. And so, back then, people were really excited about the promise of the internet and how it would bring us all together, and we would, create these new connections, and it would be so glorious. But he gave a speech like 16 years ago about how he was actually concerned that the internet would divide us in new ways. And now in 2020, we're really seeing that, and how that's really shaping up. Allsides was created kind of to make sure that we can become aware of the ways that bias works in the media, to make bias transparent, to understand that a lot of the information that's coming at us is coming from a political angle, or from people who have a political agenda, or their own partialities and preferences and ways of thinking that are going to impact the information we get. So I think a lot of people think that journalism, traditionally, it was just telling you the facts, telling you exactly what happened, and not couching that in any terms or framing that would kind of tilt you towards or against an idea or a policy initiative or wherever it may be. But as we're seeing in 2020, especially with a lot that's gone on this year, that's obviously not the case. A lot of the information that we get is tilted. So Allsides has a couple of solutions to this, and a couple of tools that we provide to help people to understand bias, to make bias transparent, and to make sure that they're not reading in a filter bubble. So a filter bubble is when you're only interacting with people and information that reinforces your existing beliefs. So if you have a left-wing view, maybe you're only ever reading CNN and the New York Times, and they're just repeating back to you your thoughts and beliefs all the time, and you think, oh, how the other side is so horrible, they're so evil, how could they think that? Because you're never actually engaging with what they think, you're never actually hearing it from them. And that goes the other way as well. So we have a balanced newsfeed where we actually rate the bias of media outlets, and we say whether they are on the left, the right, or kind of more in the center. And then we provide a news feed where we show you headlines from the day, from the day's top stories, from the left, center, and right, side by side. So you can actually compare headlines and see how different outlets are talking about the exact same story or issue. And that really helps you to start to understand how bias works, how these different types of bias manifest, to kind of give you a different view. And we also have a media bias chart where we actually have not all of the media outlets we've rated over 800, but a lot of the media outlets we've rated on a chart with their logos in different buckets, just so you can kind of see how the media landscape actually works and what side of the political spectrum different outlets are on.
Yeah, I love this, and actually, it's one of the other things. And correct me if I'm wrong about this. That I love this about Allsides, and I also pay attention to Ground News as well, which I know Ground News I think uses some of your sort of methodology in their bias associations. But one of the things I also love about what you are doing is that rather than saying, okay, this is a left-leaning source or a right-leaning source, you're showing it all at once so I can go and quickly see. And then correct me if I'm wrong, but you also have, it seems like, a way for the user to actually vote and say, yes, I agree with your bias categories, or no, I don't. And so it seems like it's not just Allsides method, but it's also, sort of crowdsourcing so that we can sort of check ourselves. So I love that you're essentially saying, we're going to let you decide on the rating and in terms of how you look at it. And we're also going to let you vote on whether you agree with us or not. And I also know, and this is really cool, that I can go in and see Julie's, also your bias in terms of the quiz that you all have. And I took that bias as well, and it says I lean a little bit left, which is what I thought. But I love the idea of this, because prior to this, what I was doing to get out of my bubble was I was cultivating my Facebook feed to be more right leaning. So I was looking at PragerU, and I was looking at the Daily Wire, and I was getting mostly right leaning news sources, whereas Twitter was more of my already sort of left bias. And I was also jumping around to Fox News and CNN and all these other things. Now with Allsides and the app, I basically just go right to you all, and then I can quickly sort of cultivate here. But I wanted to ask you, so when we are thinking about these bias categories, what actually is the methodology that you all are using? And is it one source? Is it multiple sources? How are you making these bias determinations?
Yeah, so you mentioned how we actually invite people to vote on whether or not they agree with our bias ratings. That is true. We want to know what people think. We're really curious how the average American views the New York Times or Fox News, and what do they think their bias is? Are they left, center, lean right, or right? Those are our 5 categories. But we also we try to be very clear that majority vote doesn't determine our ratings. So you can't just like get together with a bunch of your buddies and go vote on our ratings and then we'll change it because there was a majority rule. It doesn't quite work like that. We do take into account what people believe and what they think, and that's really valuable feedback. It might trigger a deeper review if a lot of people disagree. But it doesn't determine our ratings. We actually use multiple methodologies to determine our ratings. We don't rely on just one method because they all have limitations. None of them are perfect. 2 of the main methodologies that we use, one is the blind bias survey, which we actually invite people across the political spectrum to take. And this is when we have people, we present them with content from media outlets and we've stripped it of any identifying information. So you don't know where it came from. You don't know what brand it's associated with. And you read some headlines and some content from that outlet, and then you would tell us what you think the bias of that outlet is. So that's just a totally blind way of assessing how the average American from across the political spectrum sees the bias of these outlets. So that's one of our most robust methodologies. And the way that we look at the data, again, is not majority rule. We normalize the data. We look at, pluralities across bias groups, and we do different things to make sure that one group isn't overrepresented in the results. But the blind bias survey is a major way that we assess bias. We also do editorial reviews. So the Allsides team, like you said, we're transparent about our biases. So each member of the team, each staff member has on our team page what their bias is. And we make that really transparent. All of our writers on the site, people who write for our blog, we have what their bias is transparently. So the editorial team will get together and we'll actually look at a media source. We'll look at their content from the last 6 months. We don't look at it blindly. We look at what it looks like on the website with all the branding and all the different visual elements. Where did they put this headline on the page? What do they really want me to see? What are they kind of burying? We look at all these different bias indicators, and then we kind of discuss and come to a general consensus on its bias. And we'll have individuals who disagree. Usually we have a general consensus, but there are always people who are like, no, you think, the New York Times leans left. I actually think they're far left, or whatever it may be. So we try to tell people that even though we do use these different methodologies to come to like a general bias rating that fits into our 5 buckets, our 5 categories, it's not perfect. And as an individual, you're going to disagree with some of our ratings because bias is sort of in the eye of the beholder. Someone that's more far right is going to look at the New York Times and be like, wow, they're so far left. Someone who's really far left could look at, Fox News or whatever and think that they're really far right or whatever it may be. It's kind of relative depending on your perspective. But we think we do a pretty good job of generally giving people an overview. And, the bias ratings, we try to keep them as strong as possible, but they really are a means to an end. And that end is just to help people to understand that political bias does permeate the media landscape and you should get a broader view.
Yeah. It's really interesting. I don't know if you have this happen, but I like to have friends on both the right and the left. And I do have friends on the right and the left, and sometimes extreme right and left. And it's funny when you get to the extreme left think the entire media is biased right, and the extreme right thinks the entire media is biased left. Absolutely. And it's so funny because this conversation, it's like the mainstream media, and depending on who you're talking to, quote, the mainstream media means, oh, they're all right leaning, or they're all left leaning. And for me being relatively in the center, slightly leaning left, this has always bothered me because I'm just like, is it really, that you don't see at all the way this works. And as I start to look, before I found Allsides, I did start to notice that not even, the biases of particular organizations, like maybe Fox News, I saw as right leaning, and New York Times, definitely I saw as left leaning. But then if you really get into it, I see aspects of Fox News, maybe their written stuff is a little different than the stuff that's on TV, and it's a little bit more center, their written stuff. And so you really start to understand this. But that's what I like, that now I don't really have to think about this with Allsides. But I do have one question, and I don't know that you're going to be able to answer this or not, but it's something that's really curious for me. So one of the things I see happening in media is something like this. If let's say I'm far left or far right, and I decide all mainstream media is biased against my side. So let's say I'm far right and I think it's the mainstream media is all left. But then what I do to combat that is I start listening to individuals on their own blogs, doing their own thing, that have no way of testing this. So when I think about media, I tend to think journalism at least has some checks and balances. You have to have multiple sources. You have to bring this to your editor. This has to be vetted in some way. And despite what the bias might be, I still see that as better than some person with an opinion on a blog. And it's really interesting what I see happening, that so many people on the extremes of left and right will believe a single individual behind a computer screen who has no journalistic background at all, but then dismiss everything that's coming from the media. And so I'm just curious if you have an opinion on this, and what you think about this. And do you even think I'm accurate on this? You might be like, Jade, I think you're wrong about that actually I don't see that happening. But I'm just curious, because it does seem odd to me that you could have one person behind a computer, spouting off some random conspiracy theory, and then completely dismiss a media source where, at least even if that media source is biased, it certainly has some checks and balances and an editorial process. And it is more, in my mind, you can see it more transparently. But I'm curious, for someone like you who's an expert, how do you see this? Do you think, Jade, no, I don't agree with you at all, or yes, I see what you're saying?
I see what you're saying. I also have some different considerations that I would take into account when assessing that phenomenon, because you're right, that is what's happening. A lot of people are kind of being like, I'm done with the institutions, these elite institutions that have existed for so long. I don't trust them anymore. I'm going to go and listen to influencers and bloggers and podcasters or whatever it may be. And that's how I'm going to get my information. And I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with that, in the sense that there are some individuals who are doing really good work, who do understand journalistic standards, who are doing true investigative reporting independently. And they might have a Patreon where people can kind of independently support them, or whatever it may be. And they are doing good work. You're right, though, they aren't kind of, encapsulated in an institution that might have years of experience behind it, or a full editorial team, or whatever it may be. But the fact that some of these folks are independent makes people trust them more, because they don't have these sort of like entrenched financial interests that might have political ties, or whatever it may be, or that might influence their agenda. So this is why I like to tell people that, at the end of the day, it's not really about the source or who you trust. Whoever it is you're listening to, if it's an elite institution that has existed for a really long time, or an up and coming blogger or independent journalist, you still need to apply your critical thinking skills and not trust other people to think for you. You still need to learn how bias manifests. You need to learn a little bit how to do some of your own research. You need to understand the kind of tricks of language people can use to tilt you in one direction or the other, and just be very diligent in your own critical thinking and assessment of information, no matter who it's coming from. I think people have legitimate reasons for distrusting the elite institutions. I think people have legitimate reasons for distrusting the kind of up and coming individual bloggers and influencers. So at the end of the day, I wish there were another way, but it really is up to you to think critically and learn how to assess the information that you're getting.
Yeah. Well, let's, if you don't mind, let's get into that just briefly. So if you were, let's say Allsides does not exist, right? But obviously we have access to Allsides, so some of this work is being done for us. But before Allsides, or if you were going to say, Jade, let me just give you a crash course on spotting media. What would you say, Jade? Here are the things you need to look for when you are reading an article. And I guess this is partly how, probably Allsides also does it. But what am I looking for here? How do I know this is not just, an opinion piece that someone is, it's just their opinion versus this is actually, a really good editorial piece that has been vetted and has multiple sources and all this kind of stuff. Do you have some tidbits for us or some rules of thumb?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we have a resource on our website, two of them actually. The one that I always point people to is 11 types of media bias. And that just gives you a list and goes through the different types of bias and explains how they manifest and how you can actually spot them.
Oh,
So
nice.
one of the ones that I think one of the ones people are like generally pretty familiar with is sensationalism, which is when language is really vague but very colorful and dramatic. So you'll see this a lot. People are usually when they're thinking about sensationalism, they think about tabloids, shocking revelation, so remarkable, chaotic, like these words that are really colorful and dramatic are used. Explosive claims, so-and-so slams so-and-so, whatever it is. We're all pretty familiar with that type of media bias. And it does happen in tabloids, but it happens in, so-called trustworthy media outlets as well. So that's something that I usually point to first because I think people are pretty familiar with it. We see it a lot on cable news as well. Everything's breaking news, right? Yeah. Everything's a big deal. But there are some other more subtle types of bias that people should get familiar with that I don't think people know about as much. Like one of them is spin. So that's kind of when language is really vague, dramatic, or sensational, and you're kind of straying from objective, measurable facts and that we can observe, and you're kind of clouding the reader's view a little bit, and the reader can't really get a precise take on what happened. So it's kind of like a car salesman, and he's talking about how beautiful the exterior is, but he's just hiding the fact that there's something under the hood that you should be thinking about. Yeah. The journalists do this as well. They do it all the time, and there are a lot of journalists that actually act more like public relations executives, where they're trying to get you to really like a politician or to like a certain political party or an idea or whatever it may be, to kind of, and they'll kind of hide certain things that would maybe make that person or institution or idea look bad, or maybe you'd have a different perspective on it. So there are a lot of spin words and phrases that we see used in the media a lot. You'll see, allegations emerged, serious talks. So-and-so refuses to say, that implies guilt, right? Mm-hmm. Something finally surfaced. It was acknowledged. They conceded. They dodged the question. All these things kind of make you think that it kind of spins your perception a certain way. And I noticed that journalists say this a lot. Instead of just saying someone said or someone told reporters, that's just stating that something was said and then you can assess the quote for yourself. They will substitute spin words for the word said. So instead of saying someone said or told reporters, they'll say, oh, they lashed out, they erupted, they scoffed, they bragged, they fumed. There's these words that make you kind of think they're guilty or perhaps they're not trustworthy. So spin is a really big one. And then, like I said, there's 10 other types of media bias that we spell out on our website. And people should really start to get familiar with how language is used to kind of to slant you in a certain direction, make you think a certain way. We also have a resource on our site. It's, I believe, 14 types of ideological bias. And that's a little bit slightly more difficult to spot, but these kind of get into political philosophy, where you might have a journalist that has more of a libertarian lean versus a more like collectivist lean in how they think about how the world ought to be ordered and how we ought to approach our problems. There's also like traditionalist versus progressive. Are the traditional ways of culture and ordering society the best, or should we have a more progressive view where we, allow for different types of expressions? And you'll see that kind of color how a journalist talks about something. Secular versus religious, elitist versus populist, rural versus urban. There's all these different ways that journalists they're biased or tilted towards one way or the other, and that's going to impact how they report on things. So people should get familiar with these types of bias for sure.
I love this because, my background is I'm a researcher scientist guy. So I come from sort of that background. And one of the things that's really interesting is that when you're reading a research paper, what they are intentionally doing is showing you where they could have gone wrong in their hypothesis. They'll literally say, here are the things that we may have missed. Here are other people and what they found. And they're literally pointing out the holes in their argument, thinking like sort of a scientist. So for me, when I hear you say this, I want to know, like if I have a favorite journalist, I would like to know that maybe they're a little bit leaning towards a particular sort of, political viewpoint, so that I can go and find a journalist that has a different political viewpoint. For example, one of the things is that I do is I'll read certain books, political books, like maybe by Thomas Sowell, who's like, more of a right-leaning economist. And then I'll go and read Krugman, who's more of a left-leaning economist. And this is more of my science brain, but this is what I love about Allsides, because it seems to, from my perspective, that a lot of the work that I would have been doing naturally is kind of being done for me. I can kind of see it all laid out. And it's funny too, because listening to what you're saying, I remember looking at like, for example, I remember going and seeing maybe CNN and seeing some of this inflammatory language about Trump and this big sort of bombshell thing that happened that CNN is saying, and then going over to Fox and seeing that that's not even on their front page, and when they do talk about it, the language is completely different. And it was just always so interesting to me. But now I can just swipe and go, oh, I can see all of these sort of headlines right there, sort of all at once. And it's hugely important. So I guess one of the final things that I would love to sort of get your take on is a couple of things. One, how do we as individuals support this work? I mean, obviously support Allsides, but also anything else you can think about that if you were like, what, Jade, in a perfect world, this is what I would love to see humans be doing and thinking about, and how they can support this work within themselves and support other people who are doing this work. I mean, someone like you, it seems like, and someone like, the organization of Allsides, it seems like despite your lean, right, you seem to get and know that you don't know everything. I'm sort of similar, and I want to see and appreciate the other side, because I have this core belief that that's where truth comes from. If it doesn't come from my bubble, it comes from my bubble colliding with your bubble, and then that information that's exchanged there leads us to better truth. So that's sort of if I have a bias, that's kind of my bias. We all have bias, but I'm just curious for you to help us understand how we can be better, how we can support your work, or any other hints or tidbits you have for us about what we should do after being exposed to you in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think even just, this is a great start where the people who are listening to this podcast are either they already were aware or now they are aware that, the information that we get is actually trying to kind of manipulate us and manipulate our emotions and behaviors and our voting and whatever that may be. And so step one is really just being aware of that. And that's really the first step to critical thinking. That's the first step to asking questions about the information that you're getting. And I would say that's the number one thing that you can do when you're consuming the media, when you open your phone and you're looking at things on Facebook and Twitter. Ask questions. Just start to make it a practice to ask questions. This is actually what journalists are trained to do. And I would say a lot of them don't do that anymore. But you should be asking questions about the information that you get. Who might be wanting me to see this? Who might be benefiting from me seeing this? Who's not benefiting from me seeing this? Just learn how to ask questions, to go deep, and to start to really apply critical thinking to the information you get, instead of just kind of consuming it at face value and just being a passive consumer. You want to be an active consumer. You want to really just flex those muscles and understand how this really works. And that, there are agendas out there. There are people that are human, that have biases and partialities and leanings. And that's actually okay. It's actually okay to have a point of view. It's okay to have a bias. There's nothing wrong with that. The problem is that when we're not aware of it or when it's not transparent. So one of the ways you can really just be a better media consumer is being aware of that and starting to apply that sort of thinking to the information you get. And then if you want to support Allsides, there are a couple of ways. You can do something as simple as bookmarking our homepage and committing to getting a balanced view every morning when you want to know what's going on in the world. We do headline roundups where we have the top stories from the day and we provide it from multiple angles. So you can kind of get a balanced view on what's going on, see if there's something you might have missed when you were checking your Twitter bubble or your Facebook bubble or whatever that may be. You can download our mobile app, which makes it even easier. We just launched that. And then you don't have to have 20 different apps for CNN and Fox and everything else and checking all of them. We'll put it all together for you and you can just check our app and you can get a balanced view. And then we also, invite people to support us financially. We are trying not to fall into the clickbait trap. That's against our ethos. We're not going to do that. And a lot of media outlets, that's how they sustain themselves, is by inflaming your emotions and getting you to click. We're not doing that, but that means we do rely a lot on the support of readers. So people can become sustaining members, support us monthly with a small contribution, and that helps to keep us going.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, you're definitely not a hard sell. You guys are providing such a great, sort of thing for all of us, and it's, obviously I want to support that, and I think we should be supporting that because to me this really comes down to truth, right? And truth is getting lost. I have one more thing that came up for me, and then I'll let you go. I so appreciate your time, but this is just a curiosity of mine, and I'm just curious because one of the things that as someone that has a background in my specialty is metabolism and self-development. And I understand what having an expert opinion means something to me, right? So it's one of these things that in my field is really important. So I realize I'm now talking to an expert in media. And I would be remiss if I did not ask you this question that I want to ask, being an expert. One of the things that I see, and I'm really looking, this is a question, not a statement, but I'll share one of my biases with you. And I just want you to maybe answer the question by, agreeing with my bias, disagreeing with my bias, pointing holes in my argument. And it essentially goes like this. For me as a science-based guy, I see lots of different ways that I can consume information. For example, when I was, kind of coming up in the world of health and fitness, I was a rather militant vegetarian. I am no longer a vegetarian, but I would read material strictly from that perspective. And every new book that came out became my Bible. And that was the thing that now I believed in until I read the next book. And any documentary that came out that agreed with me, that became my Bible. As I gathered more and more and more information, I started to see that books were not a very good place to get true information because authors were incredibly biased. I started to see documentaries as just opinion pieces. And so this is going back to the other question about, do we listen to individuals? Do we listen to organizations? And how much stock do we put in things like specifically documentaries, books, lone authors, and stuff like that? I know that your answer is probably going to be something around, hey, it really comes down to you really understanding everything else we just talked about. But I'm curious where you in particular would go to get good information in this realm. If you weren't associated with Allsides and Allsides wasn't available, would you put stock in books and documentaries, or would you say, Jade, those are probably the worst places to get your information? I'm just curious where you would go with your background and understanding media and journalism the way you do.
I mean, I think books are a great way to get information, but I think the key is kind of what you said, where you understand that people do have a perspective, they do have a point of view, and they are trying to sell you something, right? They're trying to sell you their idea, right? So the book is going to come from that angle. It's going to be, here's what I think is the best way to do things, and here's why. And I think as long as you go into consuming information with that mentality, just knowing that that's what's going on, you can kind of get a bird's eye view and sort of objectively assess what's being presented to you. So instead of just being tossed around by the whims of the world and whatever the next person tells you, you can kind of be centered in yourself. And that does require knowing yourself and your values and that sort of thing. And you can consume information from lots of different angles, whether it's a documentary or a book or a newspaper. And instead of just being tossed around by the next thing that you read, you can kind of objectively assess it and say, you know what, I'm going to discard that and I'm going to keep that. I think it was G.K. Chesterton had a quote where he said, the human mind is like the mouth. It's meant to close on something. So, none of us want to just be like, I don't know anything and I don't have any convictions because there's so much information and everybody disagrees. So there's no truth. It's like, yeah, there is a truth. There's an objective truth. Sometimes it's hidden. Sometimes it's obscured. Sometimes you find it in weird places. I found Twitter is a great place to kind of like get into discussions and find viewpoints that I would never even hear in the mainstream media, just random people who are talking about things. And again, you have to be critical when you're consuming that and make sure you're not just being tossed around by people who, maybe don't know what they're talking about. But there's also a lot of good things to be found. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think it doesn't really matter what medium you're getting your information from necessarily, as long as you know who you are, what you value, and then you can critically and objectively kind of assess that information.
Julie, I love that answer so much. It's basically like saying, hey, stop trying to be right necessarily and just search for truth. It's almost like moving from that core value of trying to prove that I'm the smartest person in the room and instead really look for truth. And obviously Allsides is doing that. I so appreciate your time, your expertise. Thank you so much for your work. Is there anything you want to leave us with in terms of getting involved sort of with Allsides? I know that I have just downloaded the Allsides app. So definitely all of you go ahead and do that and go over to the website. Yeah, I know you have several quizzes there for people to take and just get familiar with it. But is there anything else you want to leave us with or final words?
No, I think you kind of covered it. Yeah, the website is allsides.com, and now we're on the App Store. We have our app available for Apple users and Android users. So yeah, check us out. You can take the Rate Your Bias quiz and figure out whether you lean left or right or you're in the middle. We have a lot of tools on there, and you can browse our bias ratings and indicate whether or not you agree.
I love it. Thank you so much, my friend. I really appreciate your time. And thanks everybody for listening. We will see you at the next show.